Hi, it's Roger Hamilton with another episode of Entrepreneur TV. And if you're trying to make sense of this crisis and figuring out what are the next steps, then this video is for you. As always, I'm going to stick to the facts and the data, and at the end, I'll give you the practical steps for you to take. Recently, I uploaded a video on Ray Dalio's prediction of a dollar crash, and you can click and watch that link later. And I also uploaded a video on the fourth turning and the current crisis, which you can be watching later as well. And in both of these videos, there were plenty of comments from people saying this was planned, it wasn't predicted. Now, before you criticize conspiracy theories, I'm going to explain in this video the legitimate forecasting techniques already used by the top businesses, leaders, and governments around the world. I'll go through the relationship between what gets predicted and what gets planned. And then after watching this, go ahead and make your comments. So first of all, is it even possible to predict the future? This month, Elon Musk became worth even more than Warren Buffett because the market believes that he has become better at predicting the future of his business than Warren is. This graph shows his prediction of Tesla's production from now through to 2024. The Tesla Y production is in yellow and the new China factory is in red. Now, this came out after he announced his new factories. And as long as his plan keeps on following his prediction, then he's going to keep on getting headlines like this. Tesla investor Ron Barron sees $1 trillion in revenue in 10 years, and that won't be the end. So yes, if you have the data to make a prediction, you can plan for that prediction and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, every public limited company is valued by the market based on how well it can predict the future. Hit a positive prediction and your price goes up. Start to miss and your shares go down. As for governments, stakes are much higher. The book, The Fourth Turning, says we're going into this crisis where war is inevitable. So the question is, if governments believe this, would they plan for it? Like it or not, predictions and plans are linked. And at the end of this video, I'm going to show you not just how they're linked, but how you as a leader or an entrepreneur can use this to be able to design your own future. But first, let's get context of the fourth turning by looking at the top 5 prediction systems of the last century. Prediction number 1 is K-waves. K-waves or Kondratiev waves were created by Nikolai Kondratieff, who is an economist from Russia, back in the 1920s. He discovered a long wave cycle in the capitalist system, which links everything from innovation to interest rates to debt to trade. Here's a graph from the long wave group where it shows the last 3 of these waves and the 4th wave that we're in right now. Each wave starts in the spring with a new innovation cycle, with slow growth and also low debt. Then comes the summer where you now have high growth and high return, as well as high debt. And as you get to the autumn, you're getting to a peak of both debt and return. And you can see in the graph, the roaring 20s just before the Great Depression and the big run up in the market that we've seen over the last 10 years. Then the winter comes when there's a big deleveraging and a crash. You can see the last crash happened at the end of the 1920s, leading to the 1930s depression. This graph was actually drawn up in 2012, and you can see 2020 as being the next crisis point and the next depression. K-waves have been used for a long time by both commodity traders and stock market traders. And of course, using them turns a prediction into a plan, because if people think the market's going up, they'll buy and the market will go up. If they think it's going down, then they'll sell and it will go down. So what happened to Kondratieff? Stalin was not happy with his economists saying that the capitalist system would recover from the depression. And so in 1938, he was not only imprisoned, but he was sentenced to death and executed. The West recovered as Kondratieff predicted, but unfortunately he was not around to see it. Prediction number 2 is economic waves. Harvard professor Joseph Schumpeter took off where Kondratieff finished. He combined K-waves with Kuznets swings, which are 15 to 25 year infrastructure investment cycles, Juglar cycles, which are more like 7 to 11 year fixed investment cycles, Kitchin cycles, which link 3 to 5 year commodity swings. And he created economic long waves with this, which showed booms and busts in the market. He popularized the term creative disruption, showing it was entrepreneurs that were the ones who would be disrupting the market over time. And you can see from this graph how this is an accelerating cycle that we're actually living into today, with the current cycle predicted also to end in 2020. Which brings us on to Ray Dalio's currency cycles. In a recent LinkedIn post, Ray explains how, because governments are able to predict these business cycles, they counter them with their own planned cycles of printing money and issuing debt. He says these moves typically come in the form of short-term debt cycles and long-term debt cycles. The short-term cycles of ups and downs typically last about 8 years, give or take a few. He goes on to say, most people have seen enough of these short-term debt cycles to know what they are like, so much so that they mistakenly think that they will go on working this way forever. Over long periods of time, these short-term debt cycles add up to long-term debt cycles that typically last about 50 to 75 years. Because they come along about once in a lifetime, most people aren't aware of them. As a result, they typically take people by surprise, which hurts a lot of people. The last big long-term debt cycle was put in place in 1945 when World War II ended and we began the dollar US-dominated world order. Here's a graph from Ray which shows the last two of the global reserve currencies, the Dutch guilder and the British pound. And it predicts the coming to an end of the current debt cycle and the end of the US dollar as a reserve currency. And here's what Ray Dalio had to say this week in a Fox interview. He says there's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical war, and there could be a capital war. That's the reality. And if we don't work together to do the sound things, to be productive, to earn more than we spend, to build the stability of our currency and build a good balance sheet, we are going to decline. Of course, Ray is familiar with K waves, with economic waves, with business cycles. He spent his life looking at these patterns. And if you need proof to show that predictions can turn into plans, Ray has used all of these systems to be able to create trading algorithms that has turned his company, which was Bridgewater Associates, into the largest hedge fund in the world. It's worth over $138 billion today simply because Ray has become better at planning for these predictions than most others. And that brings us on to prediction number 4, generations. Neil Howe and William Strauss looked at all of these different patterns and theories and came out with their own generational theory, which went back over 500 years of American history and broke down these cycles into 80-year seculums, which is about the lifespan of a typical human. Each of these seculum were then broken down into 4 different seasons, which each were about 20 to 22 years apart, which was the birth cycle from one generation to the next. And you can see from this graph, they were able to predict back 30 years ago the millennial generation. And they also named the fourth turning as the crisis period, the next one being the one we're in right now from 2005 to 2025. So what did Howe and Strauss do with all of this information? And did they benefit from it? Well, first, they published a series of books. Generations came out in 1991. 13th Gen, which is my generation of Gen Xers, came out in 1993. The Fourth Turning, which was all about this crisis, came out in 1997. And Millennials Rising came out in 2000. Now, William Strauss passed away in 2007, but Neil Howe has continued to build his career based on his predictions. First, as president of Lifeforce Associates, where he gets paid by companies to be able to train them on his predictions. So, for example, being able to show people how they should be marketing to millennials. And more recently, as managing director of Hedgeye, he's now advising hedge funds and investors on what's coming next within the markets. So companies are willing to pay for predictive marketing advice and investors are willing to pay even more for predictive investment advice. But where does this information cross between business to governments? Their book Generations had such an impact on Al Gore that he called it the most influential book on American history he had ever read. And then he sent a copy to every single member of Congress. And then when Bill Clinton ran for president, he chose Al Gore as his running mate based on the book and the fact that the two of them were of the same generation. Their book, The Fourth Turning, had a massive impact on former Goldman Sachs investment banker and the head of Breitbart News, Steve Bannon. Bannon wrote and directed a movie called Generation Zero, which was all about the Fourth Turning, and that was just before he became Donald Trump's White House chief strategist. In 2017, Neil Howe then wrote an article for the Washington Post where he says, "Where did Steve Bannon get his worldview from my book?" He writes, "The headlines this month have been alarming. Steve Bannon's obsession with the dark theory of history should be worrisome. Steve Bannon believes the apocalypse is coming and war is inevitable. Steve Bannon wants to start World War III. And then he goes on to say, America entered a new fourth turning in 2008. It is likely to last until around 2030. Our paradigm suggests that current trends will deepen as we move toward the halfway point. Further adverse events, possibly another financial crisis or a major armed conflict, will galvanize public opinion and mobilize leaders to take more decisive action. The United States could find itself at war. I certainly do not hope for war. I simply make a sobering observation. Every total war in US history has occurred during a fourth turning, and no fourth turning has yet unfolded without one." Linette Lopez went further, saying about Bannon, he believes that for the new world order to rise, there must be a massive reckoning, that we will soon reach our climax conflicts in the White House. he has shown that he is willing to advise Trump to enact policies that will disrupt our current order to bring about what he perceives as a necessary new one. He encourages breaking down political and economic alliances and turning away from traditional American principles to cause chaos. In that way, Bannon seems to be trying to bring about the fourth turning. So is what is happening now prediction or planned? There are conspiracy theories that governments are making the predictions of crises and wars a self-fulfilling prophecy by actually planning for them. Just like there are conspiracy theories that central banks are actually deliberately debasing their money supply by printing more debt. If these were true, we'd expect central banks to be creating debt and starting to buy up gold years before the crisis were actually predicted. But actually, that's exactly what has been happening. This graphic from The Economist shows in the last decade, China has grown to issue more debt to more countries than anyone else. And this Harvard Business Review article from this February says in total, the Chinese state and its subsidiaries have lent about $1.5 trillion in direct loans and trade credits to more than 150 countries around the globe. This has turned China into the world's largest official creditor, surpassing traditional official lenders such as the World Bank, the IMF, or all OECD creditor governments combined. As for gold, while it's reaching record highs while the US dollar is falling to lows, the central banks have actually been buying up gold for the last 10 years. And we hit a record in the last 2 years of 656 tons being bought in 2018 and another 650 tons just last year. And in preparation for the crisis we're experiencing today, governments have been repatriating gold back into their countries for the last 5 years. There's been over 1,200 tons taken out of the gold vaults from New York and London. And now today we're seeing these kinds of headlines. New York Times, officials push US-China relations towards point of no return. China is following Mao's dictum by keeping two front war options against India open. US could attack China, seize disputed islands in South China Sea before 2020, US elections, military experts. Ties between the US and China are probably the worst they have ever been, especially after the Trump administration imposed all-round, high-intensity, maximum pressure on China on political, diplomatic, economic, and military fronts. Now, before I answer whether I think this is predicted or planned, we've got one more prediction system to cover. Prediction number 5, war cycles. In 1942, University of Chicago professor Quincy Wright wrote a book. It was called A Study of War, which showed how every 50 years there was a minor war leading into every 100 years a major war. British historian Arnold Toynbee then built on this pattern by looking at 28 past civilizations and how they rose and fell. He linked Quincy Wright's war cycles with K-waves, and his work earned him a front cover of Time magazine. And then in 1988, Professor Joshua Goldstein from American University came out with this book, Long Cycles, Prosperity and War in the Modern Age. The entire book studies the relationship between war cycles, economic cycles, and K-waves. And the cycle predicts a war around about this time, the same time predicted by both the fourth turning and Ray Dalio. So how do all these 5 predictions compare? The main thing is how similar they are. Number 1, they all look at past patterns to predict future patterns. Number 2, they all link to our lifetimes. A major war takes place after all of those who remember the last one have passed away. And number 3, they become self-fulfilling because all the leaders that are aware of these predictions then play into them with their plans. As an example, here's an article from a year ago. The US military is preparing for a new war. After years of a fruitless war on terror, the Pentagon is turning its focus to China and Russia. And it goes on to explain how the US military, predicting that there will be a war with either China or Russia, is actually choosing where that war might occur, starting with the South China Sea. They made plans for that prediction, and now we're seeing the escalation happening today. So is the coming economic crash planned or predicted? Is the next war planned or predicted? The truth is, it's a bit of both. Because one thing is for sure, with these prediction systems, when it does happen, it's not going to be either unexpected or a surprise. And to dismiss the idea that things that are planned are somehow conspiracy theories would be like Elon Musk predicting that electric self-driving cars are going to continue to grow, and then planning for that is somehow a conspiracy. Now, would we have a world of self-driving cars without Elon? Probably. But with this plan, the likelihood is much more assured. And would we have a monetary crash and a possible war without the current governments? Maybe, but with their plans, they are also much more assured. So yes, you can dismiss future predictions as pseudoscience and dismiss planned futures as conspiracies, or you can see all predictions and plans are actually connected and led by those interested enough in the past to be looking to the future. Now, you can't control most of this, but if you see the benefit of finding the best predictions to your life, your country, and your community, or finding the best predictions for your business, your industry, or your investments, then you can set a plan to make that prediction come true. And until you create your own plan, there's a pretty good chance you can be part of someone else's plan. You decide, but the key is to find the certainty in a sea of uncertainty. In my case, while the timing of the ongoing crisis and possible war is uncertain, what I do know is certain is more and more of us are looking to self-educate ourselves, and more of us are looking to find ways to be more self-sufficient, which is why all my focus is on how I can help grow the education revolution and the entrepreneur movement. And when planning my future, I choose to follow Jack Canfield's philosophy, where he says, "I've always been the opposite of a paranoid. I operate as if everyone is part of a plot to enhance my well-being." Whatever you believe, choose your certainty and plan your own future. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. And at the same time, do make sure you subscribe so I can keep you up to date every week throughout this crisis. I've left links to all of the books and articles that I've mentioned in this video. I thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next week.